The November light was gray and thin when it fell across the sterile walls of Hahnemann University Hospital in Philadelphia. The corridors smelled of disinfectant and weariness, the kind of place where time seemed to fold in on itself. Behind one of those doors lay Gia Carangi, once the most captivating face in the world of fashion, now unrecognizable to those who had only known her from glossy magazine spreads. She was just 26 years old, but her body carried the weight of a lifetime's collapse. There were no photographers here, no flashes to illuminate her sharp cheekbones or the wild, restless eyes that once stared out from billboards. In their place were tubes, thin sheets, and the quiet buzz of medical machines. AIDS had carved its way through her body, leaving her fragile, diminished, nearly transparent. Her hair, once a cascade of unruly dark waves, lay limp against the pillow. The nurses who came and went saw only a patient, not a legend. And perhaps that was the cruelest part. How the world seemed to have already erased her before she had even gone. The hospital window overlooked Philadelphia's streets, where winter approached, and leaves gathered like lost confetti in the gutters. For Gia, the world outside was already far away. She was no longer the girl who once stalked down Manhattan's runways in leather jackets and silk, no longer the muse who set a new standard for beauty. Here she was, anonymous, her fame reduced to whispers among a few doctors who remembered the covers of Vogue and Cosmopolitan. Beside her bed, her mother sat in vigil. Their relationship had been fractured for years, marked by absences and silence, but now the distance collapsed into proximity. Families often return at the end, when time is short and words are heavy. The hum of the machines filled the spaces where conversation could not. What can be said to someone slipping away? Love, regret, apology. All of it condenses into silence, the kind that lingers heavier than speech. The scene held motifs of eerie symbolism. The clock on the wall ticked forward, indifferent to the drama unfolding beneath it. Each movement of the second hand was both ordinary and profound, measuring not just time, but the dwindling of a life. The mirror in the hospital bathroom, just feet away, reflected nothing of Gia's past glamour, only a body ravaged, a face gaunt, the contours of fame eroded. It was as if the mirror itself bore witness to her disappearance, holding in its glass not the supermodel the world adored, but the shadow of what had been. Psychologically, there is a cruelty in watching greatness reduced to anonymity. Humans are drawn to continuity, to the belief that what burns bright must remain so. Yet Gia's hospital bed revealed the opposite, that brilliance can fade into obscurity, and the world will move on. For those who remembered her in photographs, the juxtaposition would have been almost unbearable. The supermodel, the icon, now a patient in a ward few would ever enter. On the morning of the 18th of November, 1986, the silence in Gia's room became permanent. She died quietly, without spectacle, her departure unmarked by the industry that had once built itself upon her face. Outside, the city continued. Its rhythm cars surged through intersections. Pedestrians hurried across streets, and the world spun without pause. But in that small hospital room, time seemed to stop, leaving only a silence that felt both intimate and infinite. And so the story begins not with a flashbulb or a runway, but with silence. A silence that asks, how does someone who once embodied everything youth, beauty, rebellion, come to vanish in a hospital bed, forgotten by the world she once defined? Long before the hospital corridors and the quiet grief, there was a girl whose face ignited an industry. In the late 1972nd, Gia Carangi stepped into the fashion world like a spark thrown onto dry kindling. Agencies, photographers, and designers all seemed to recognize it at once. This was not just another model. This was a presence, a force. She had something raw, untamed, a kind of beauty that did not fit the polished mold but instead shattered it. Born in Philadelphia in 1960, Gia was the youngest child of a troubled family. Her parents' marriage fractured early, and the wounds of abandonment never healed. Yet from the beginning, she carried in her the duality that would define her life: fragility wrapped in fire. At 17, restless and craving escape, she drifted toward New York, where the runways and nightclubs collided in a fever of excess. Her arrival was like a storm. Wilhelmina Cooper, the legendary model turned agent, saw Gia and declared her unforgettable. Within months, Gia's face was everywhere. On the covers of Vogue and Cosmopolitan, plastered across department store campaigns, painted into the dreams of photographers who adored her and feared her intensity. She was not the polished all-American blonde archetype of the decade. She was dark-haired, androgynous, fierce. Her eyes carried a challenge, a promise of danger. On set, she embodied contradiction. Before the camera, she became electric, sensual, commanding, alive. Off set, she fidgeted, laughed too loud, drifted into moods that were as volatile as her career was meteoric. But that volatility was part of her magnetism. Photographers spoke of her ability to transform a shoot, to make every frame pulse with life. She was not posing, they said. She was living in the image. The fashion world, always hungry for novelty, devoured her. She walked runways in Paris, posed in sunlit studios in Manhattan, lounged in leather jackets against graffiti-splashed walls. Everywhere she went, she carried with her a sense of danger, as if at any moment she might bolt or combust. And audiences loved it. She was the face of a new era, an era less about perfect composure and more about raw authenticity. There is an eerie motif in her rise. The camera lends itself. The lens captured what the eye could not hold, freezing Gia's energy into permanence. Yet the camera is also a thief, extracting pieces of identity and selling them as illusion. For Gia, each click of the shutter was both an exaltation and a diminishment. She was worshipped in images, but rarely seen as herself. Psychologically, the experience of being both idolized and objectified carved deep fault lines into her. To the world, she was the image of strength and sensuality, but inside, she was still the girl from Philadelphia, longing for tenderness, for safety, for a place where she could set down the mask. Every photo shoot was another mirror, another reflection of who she was supposed to be. And mirrors, when multiplied, can distort as much as they reflect. By the dawn of the 1982nd, Gia was not just a model, she was a phenomenon. She defined campaigns for Armani, Versace, Dior. She was the muse of Richard Avedon, Francesco Scavullo, and Chris von Wangenheim, each capturing her in frames that shimmered with both allure and foreboding. She was on top of the world, a face everyone recognized. But fame, especially the kind that erupts overnight, is never stable. Like a flame burning too quickly, Gia's rise carried within it the seeds of collapse. The very intensity that made her unforgettable would soon turn inward, consuming her in ways the camera could not capture. For now, though, the image remains. Gia Carangi, luminous in black and white, eyes piercing the viewer with the promise of beauty that felt dangerous, alive, and unstoppable. A face that changed fashion, but at a cost it would not acknowledge until it was far too late. The photographs of Gia Carangi told one story, the story of a fearless beauty who seemed to command the world with the tilt of her chin, the arch of her brow, the restless gleam in her eyes. But behind the camera's gaze, beyond the carefully staged sets and the bursts of flashbulbs, another story unfolded, one far quieter, lonelier, and more fragile. In New York, Gia was constantly surrounded by people. Stylists pulling at her clothes, makeup artists brushing color onto her skin, photographers circling her like hunters who had caught rare prey. Yet when the work was done and the lights dimmed, she often found herself alone. The applause of the fashion world was intoxicating, but it dissolved quickly, leaving her in hotel rooms where silence felt cavernous. Her childhood wounds, the abandonment by her mother, the turbulence of her parents' split, lingered like unhealed fractures. No amount of glamour could disguise them, and no photograph could edit them away. In interviews, Gia sometimes revealed slivers of this truth. A restlessness, a yearning to be held and understood, not just seen. But the industry had no patience for vulnerability. It demanded images, not confessions. Photographers adored her for her wildness. Chris von Wangenheim once shot her posing behind a chain-link fence with wild dogs, an image that radiated both danger and seduction. Gia didn't flinch. She seemed to lean into the menace, to embrace it. But behind that embrace lay something deeper. A girl who had learned to turn fear into spectacle, pain into performance. The camera devoured it, rewarded it, and in doing so, reinforced her disguise. The motif of glass becomes haunting here. Camera lenses, mirrors, glossy magazine covers, all smooth surfaces reflecting Gia's image back to the world. But glass is also a barrier. The more she was seen, the less she was touched. People fell in love with the illusion of Gia, not the human being behind it. And she knew it. Behind the lens, she often let her guard down, staring into the camera, as though daring it to catch her real self. Sometimes, in those raw frames, one can glimpse not the supermodel but the young woman, tired, almost pleading. Psychologically, this split between image and self was corrosive. To be adored for something you are not is to feel unseen, even in the brightest spotlight. For Gia, the applause was always laced with isolation. Her identity was being consumed, photographed, distributed in magazines across the world, yet she herself remained untethered, longing for a connection that could survive beyond the gloss of paper. The nightlife of Manhattan deepened the contrast. By day, she was luminous on set, draped in couture. By night, she wandered clubs where music pounded like a heartbeat, her beauty drawing admirers and predators alike. In those dark rooms, under neon haze, she was not Gia the model. She was just Gia, restless, searching, sometimes reckless. It was there, in those spaces between work and solitude, that the shadows first began to gather. The world saw her as untouchable. But behind the camera's gaze, Gia Carangi was already beginning to fracture, caught between the perfection of her images and the imperfections of her heart. Every photo shoot, every cover, every ad campaign only deepened the divide. She was everywhere, yet she was nowhere at all. By the early 1982nd, the glow of Gia's meteoric rise began to dim, replaced by a darker radiance, the harsh lights of nightclubs, the glimmer of syringes under neon shadows. New York's after-hours scene was intoxicating. Studio 54, Mud Club, and countless others where music throbbed like a living pulse, where glitter mixed with sweat, and where beauty was both currency and camouflage. For Gia, these nights were freedom at first, an escape from the suffocating expectations of the camera. But freedom quickly transformed into captivity. Heroin entered the picture almost quietly, as it so often does. At first, it was a way to soften the sharp edges of loneliness, to blur the gnawing ache of absence she carried inside. Friends recalled her perched on velvet banquettes, head thrown back in laughter, the dark-haired girl who drew every gaze. But later in the same evening, she might disappear into a bathroom or a shadowed corner, returning with eyes dimmed, her brilliance dulled. The paradox was cruel. The very industry that fed on her wildness also recoiled from it. Photographers who once celebrated her unpredictability now whispered about missed shoots, slurred mornings, veins that told their own story. Needles became part of her ritual, as necessary as makeup brushes and hairspray had once been. The skin of her arms bore the traces, thin punctures that no concealer could fully disguise. There is an eerie motif in these years, the needle as a symbol. A slender piece of metal, capable of both glamour and destruction. The same tool used by designers to stitch gowns, by doctors to deliver medicine, was also the instrument by which Gia both numbed and destroyed herself. Each injection carried both relief and ruin, a temporary silence followed by deeper echoes of despair. Psychologically, addiction offered her a dangerous illusion: control. In a world where agencies, magazines, and photographers dictated her every move, heroin provided the opposite: a private ritual, a secret escape that belonged only to her. But the price of this illusion was steep. As tolerance grew, so did dependency, and soon the escape became a prison. The nightclubs mirrored this cycle. What began as luminous gatherings of art, music, and rebellion decayed into dens of exploitation and decay. Gia became both star and casualty within them. Lovers passed through, some offering tenderness, others merely taking what they desired. Friendships frayed. By the time the sun rose over Manhattan, Gia often found herself adrift, more fragile than before, her body carrying the weight of both euphoria and collapse. Her modeling work began to falter. Agencies noticed her unreliability. Clients complained. Shoots were canceled. Once, she had been greeted with the fervor reserved for legends. Now, phones went unanswered, offers dried up, and the city that had crowned her queen turned its gaze elsewhere. Fame is merciless in its hunger for the next face. Gia, once the future, was already becoming the past. Still, in some photographs from this period, she radiates with almost unbearable beauty. The camera captured her with tousled hair, shadowed eyes, lips slightly parted. And yet, if one looks closely, there is something haunted in those frames, a flicker of the exhaustion she carried. The lens, for all its ability to glamorize, could not entirely hide the truth. Needles and neon, the twin lights of her nights. One sharp and metallic, the other glowing and electric. Together, they illuminated Gia's descent, a fall as fast and dazzling as her rise. And just as before, the world was watching, but not intervening. For all her fame, for all the bodies that crowded around her in nightclubs and photo shoots, Gia Carangi's deepest hunger was not for applause, but for love. It was a hunger that never found a steady home. Her relationships, like shards of broken glass, reflected both passion and pain, intense, fleeting, and often unfinished. Gia's sexuality was fluid, unapologetically open at a time when the world was still hesitant to look such truths in the eye. She loved women fiercely, sometimes recklessly, unafraid to hold a girlfriend's hand in public or kiss her openly at a party. But what seemed fearless on the surface was also a plea: to be seen, to be claimed, to be loved without condition. The fashion industry, built on illusion, tolerated her boldness as part of her mystique. But behind the applause lingered disapproval, whispers, and isolation. Her romances were complicated, marked by intensity and abrupt collapse. One girlfriend remembered her as deeply tender writing notes, calling constantly, clinging with an almost desperate devotion. Yet the same devotion often became suffocating, tangled with jealousy, and strained by Gia's spirals into drugs. Lovers walked away, unable to carry both her passion and her darkness. Each departure reopened the wound of abandonment she had carried since childhood, when her mother left and her father kept his distance. The motif of the empty bed is telling here. Despite the lovers who passed through her life, the nights often ended with Gia alone, reaching for comfort that was not there. Beds in hotel rooms, in apartments, in borrowed spaces all became stages for her solitude. Sheets rumpled not by rest but by restless turning, pillows that held no lasting imprint but her own. Psychologically, her quest for love was not just about romance, it was about repair. Every embrace was an attempt to mend the fracture left by her parents' separation, to prove that someone could stay, that permanence was possible. But permanence eluded her. Like her career, her love life was brilliant in bursts, then gone in silence. In moments of clarity, Gia spoke of wanting something simple: a home, a partner, a life where she did not have to perform. But simplicity was denied her. The forces of addiction, fame, and the industry's ruthless pace ensured that her relationships remained fragmented, never whole. Even friendships frayed under the weight of her need, as those closest to her found themselves exhausted by the constant push and pull of her affection and her despair. Yet there were moments, fleeting but unforgettable, when love softened her chaos. A stolen weekend with a lover, spent away from the city, walking hand in hand through quiet streets. A night in a borrowed apartment where she cooked dinner, laughed without pretense, and allowed herself to be just Gia. Not the model, not the addict, not the wounded child. These fragments of love shimmered like jewels scattered in the dark, proof that she was capable of tenderness, of joy, of belonging. But fragments, however beautiful, are still incomplete. And for Gia, incompleteness was the constant. Love arrived, burned brightly, and vanished, leaving behind only echoes. The empty bed, the unanswered phone, the silence after the door closed. These became her companions as much as any lover had been. In the end, Gia's love story was not a single narrative, but a collage of fragments, each carrying both light and shadow. Together, they reveal a woman who longed not for the world's gaze, but for one person who would not look away, a longing that remained unfulfilled, even as the cameras continued to capture her beauty for everyone, but the one she most needed. The fall was not sudden. It was slow, uneven, like a chandelier swaying before it shatters. By 1982, the name Gia, once whispered with awe in studios and runways from New York to Paris, was spoken with hesitation. Photographers who had once fought for her presence now found excuses. Designers quietly replaced her with fresher faces. The agencies that had once praised her rebellious energy grew weary of the chaos that followed her to every set. She began missing shoots, showing up late, or arriving too fragile to work. Once, she nodded off under the bright lights of a studio, the camera shutter clicking into silence. Another time, she appeared with sleeves hastily pulled down to hide bruises, her beauty compromised by the evidence of her private war. The industry, impatient and ruthless, had little tolerance for fragility. Gia, who had once embodied the edge fashion craved, now represented something the industry could not market: decline. The phone calls slowed. The assignments dwindled. What had once been a calendar full of bookings became days of silence. In her apartment, phones lay still, mirrors unconsulted, the air heavy with stillness. Friends who visited found her withdrawn, drifting between bursts of charm and long hours of disconnection. The same energy that had once electrified photographs seemed to dissipate, leaving her diminished, as though the lens no longer recognized her. The motif of the extinguished light fits here. Gia's career was like a stage where the spotlight slowly dimmed, until only a faint glow remained. In the beginning, the light was blinding, dazzling everyone who saw her. But lights in fashion are always temporary. They shift quickly to the next face, the next story, leaving the one who once stood illuminated alone in the shadows. For Gia, that darkness arrived faster than most. Psychologically, falling from the spotlight can be as devastating as the rise is intoxicating. Fame, once internalized, becomes a part of identity. To lose it is not just to lose work, but to lose a sense of self. Gia had been told she was the future, the face of a generation. Now the silence suggested the opposite, that she was already the past. It is one thing to be forgotten by strangers. It is another to be erased by the world that once defined you. Attempts at recovery came in fits and starts. She checked into rehab, made promises, appeared at shoots with renewed effort. For brief moments, it seemed possible she might reclaim her place. But the industry's memory is short, and its appetite is endless. New faces, fresh, unscarred, eager, took her place. Gia's return was met, not with applause, but with indifference. There is a haunting photograph from this period. Gia in profile, her features still striking, but her expression vacant, her eyes unfocused. The image captures the paradox of her decline. The beauty remained, but the spark was dimmed, replaced by the weariness of someone who has been consumed and discarded. By the mid-1982nd, Gia was no longer on covers, no longer headlining campaigns. The fashion world, which had once worshipped her, moved on without ceremony. In its silence lay a profound cruelty, an erasure so complete it felt intentional. To those who remembered her, it was as though she had been erased not only from the industry, but from the city itself. Gia had not simply fallen from the spotlight. She had been pushed, ignored, abandoned, left in the shadows to face herself, without the applause that once masked her wounds. And in those shadows, the descent into darker territory began to accelerate, pulling her toward a fate the world would barely acknowledge when it arrived. By the time the spotlight had fully turned away, Gia found herself face to face with something she could no longer avoid, her own reflection. Mirrors, once allies that affirmed her beauty and sustained her career, now became adversaries. Where she had once seen a face that defined an era, she now saw hollowed cheeks, bruised arms, and eyes dulled by exhaustion. The same mirror that once confirmed her power now revealed her ruin. Her beauty, though still undeniable, was marked by time and torment. Years of heroin left scars that makeup could not conceal, marks that sleeves and shadows tried to hide. Her body, once draped in couture and immortalized by lenses, bore the quiet testimony of addiction's toll. Friends described her staring into mirrors for long minutes, silent, as if searching for the girl who had once commanded every room. But that girl was gone, or perhaps buried, unreachable behind layers of regret. There is something uncanny about a mirror in decline. It holds no memory. It offers only what stands before it in the present moment. For Gia, this was both a truth and a torment. Every time she leaned toward the glass, she was forced to reconcile the myth of Gia Carangi, the supermodel, the icon with the reality of Gia, the woman in retreat. The myth was flawless, eternal, printed in magazines across the globe. The reality was fleeting, fragile, slipping away in a small apartment where silence grew heavier each night. Psychologically, mirrors can act as thresholds, portals between the self we project and the self we conceal. For someone like Gia, whose livelihood was built upon image, the betrayal of the mirror was devastating. It no longer gave her the weapon she once wielded against the world. Instead, it exposed her, stripped her of illusion, left her vulnerable to truths she could not escape. This confrontation extended beyond the literal. The mirror became a symbol of the industry itself. Fashion had once reflected Gia as perfection, presenting her to the world as an untouchable muse. But just as the mirror offers no permanence, the industry offered no loyalty. Both reflected only the present. And in the present, Gia was no longer useful. Friends who visited during these years recalled finding her apartments dimly lit, curtains drawn, mirrors smudged. Some said she avoided them altogether, unwilling to face what they revealed. Others remembered her adjusting her hair, applying lipstick with trembling hands, a defiant attempt to recover the image she once carried. The gestures were haunting, small rebellions against inevitability, against time, against a reflection that refused to flatter. The motif of the broken body and the intact mirror is chilling. Her body bore the fractures of addiction, but the mirror itself never shattered. It remained whole, impartial, reflecting her decline with unwavering honesty. In this way, the mirror became almost cruel, refusing to distort, refusing to soften, insisting on truth. There was a philosophical question hidden in this. What is more unbearable, the loss of beauty, or the memory of having once possessed it? For Gia, the mirror did not only show her present self, it forced her to remember who she had been. The contrast was unbearable. A wound reopened every time her eyes met her reflection. And so the mirror, once a tool of validation, became a witness to her ruin. Silent, impartial, unbroken, it reflected the disappearance of a woman who had once defined beauty, a disappearance that no camera would capture and no audience would applaud. By the mid-1982nd, the shadows that had gathered around Gia Carangi took on a new, merciless shape. It began with exhaustion that seemed too heavy, fevers that did not break, infections that lingered longer than they should. At first, doctors searched for simple explanations: her body weakened by years of heroin, her immune system strained. But in 1986, the word emerged, hushed, dreaded: AIDS. It was a diagnosis that carried not only a death sentence, but a stigma. In those years, Hawaii V, AIDS was spoken of in whispers, cloaked in fear, often associated with shame. Public understanding was clouded by panic and prejudice. To receive the diagnosis was to be marked not just as ill, but as untouchable. For Gia, who had once been the most touched, the most seen, the most desired, the cruelty was almost unbearable. Her body, already fragile, now carried the weight of an invisible adversary. Skin that had once glowed under camera lights grew pale. Her strength withered. The stylists and photographers who had once fought for her vanished completely. Fashion thrives on the illusion of immortality, and AIDS shattered that illusion. No designer wanted their brand associated with illness. No magazine wanted to capture decline. Gia, who had once been everywhere, was now nowhere at all. The hospital became her world. White corridors, antiseptic air, the steady beep of machines. The glamour of runways and studios was replaced with the drab monotony of medical rooms. AIDS patients in the 1982nd were often isolated, treated with fear by those meant to care for them. Some nurses hesitated to touch her, as if contact alone might condemn them. Gia, who had once lived for the intimacy of touch, hand on hand, skin on skin, lovers' embraces, was now encased in a silence that was colder than any rejection she had known before. The motif of the clock returns here, relentless in its indifference. Each tick marked the narrowing of time, the erasure of possibilities. Once, clocks had measured her rise appointments, shoots, flights across continents. Now, they measured only decline, counting down a life that was slipping away too young. Psychologically, a diagnosis does more than describe the body. It redefines identity. Gia was no longer the face of fashion, no longer even the addict. She was now an AIDS patient, reduced in the eyes of society to a label that carried stigma, fear, and silence. To be defined by illness was to be erased in a different way, to have one's complexity reduced to a single word. And yet, within this silence, something human stirred. Estranged from much of her world, Gia returned to her mother's care. Their relationship, fractured for years, found a fragile reconciliation in those hospital rooms. Mothers and daughters often find their way back to each other at the end, through grief, through regret, through love too long delayed. In her final days, Gia had someone to hold her hand. Not a photographer, not a lover, but family. The world outside those hospital walls carried on, oblivious. Models walked new runways. Magazines printed new faces. The industry churned forward, as it always does. But in that hospital room, time slowed. Silence deepened. and a young woman who had once defined beauty for an entire generation was reduced to a whisper. Her fate sealed by a diagnosis that was as much social as it was medical. Gia's story, already marked by loss, now entered its most tragic chapter. Her beauty had once made her immortal, but in the face of AIDS, even immortality seemed fragile, already crumbling into silence. When the end came on the 18th of November, 1986, there were no headlines in the fashion magazines, no editorials lamenting the loss of a star. Gia Carangi, once hailed as the future of modeling, was gone at 26, and the world of fashion barely paused. Her funeral took place quietly in Philadelphia, far from the runways of New York and Paris that had once immortalized her image. The pews were sparsely filled. Family, a few childhood friends, some who had known her before the cameras and the drugs and the fame. The great names of fashion, the designers, photographers, agents, were absent. For them, the story of Gia had ended long before the coffin was closed. To attend would mean acknowledging a world they preferred to forget. The drugs, the scandal, the illness that still hung in the air like an unspoken accusation. The ceremony itself was simple. A wooden coffin, a scattering of flowers, hymns sung softly by those who still carried her memory. There was no spectacle, no tribute befitting someone who had once defined an era's beauty. Instead, there was a silence heavy with both grief and erasure. It was as though the fashion world had conspired to bury not only Gia, but the memory of her altogether. In funerals, objects carry weight. Here, it was the absence of objects that spoke the loudest. No glossy photographs displayed, no reel of her magazine covers projected, no tangible recognition of the phenomenon she had been. Only a coffin and a handful of mourners, left to hold memories that the industry had discarded. The motif of absence resonates cruelly. Gia's life had been about presence commanding cameras, filling rooms, drawing every eye. Yet her death was marked by absence. Absent crowds, absent tributes, absent recognition. In that silence, one could hear the indifference of an industry that had used her face until it no longer served, then abandoned her to obscurity. Psychologically, forgetting is often an act of denial. By refusing to acknowledge Gia's death, fashion avoided confronting its own complicity. To remember her was to remember the industry's failure to protect, its exploitation of youth and vulnerability, its refusal to stand by those who fell. Erasure was easier. To call her forgotten was not entirely true. Her image still lingered in archives. Her beauty still haunted old photographs, but forgetting was the chosen narrative, a silence imposed rather than natural. For her family, the funeral was personal, not public. A daughter, a sister, a child laid to rest. They grieved not the supermodel, but the girl who had grown up in Philadelphia, who had once laughed in kitchens, played in backyards, dreamed beyond the boundaries of her neighborhood. In their mourning, there was intimacy. But beyond the church doors, the world carried on untouched, as though Gia had never lived at all. And so the burial closed not only a life, but a chapter written in vanishing ink. The earth accepted her coffin. The flowers wilted, the mourners dispersed. What remained was silence deeper than before, a silence that seemed to confirm the erasure. The fashion world had already moved on to new faces, new muses, new myths. Gia Carangi was gone, and her absence was folded neatly into the oblivion of forgetting. Yet silence is never absolute. Beneath it, memory waits. In the decades since her quiet funeral, Gia Carangi has returned not in flesh, but as a ghost that refuses to fade. She lingers in photographs, in the pages of fashion archives, in the whispers of those who still recall her wildness and her beauty. Her life, though brief, left an imprint deeper than many who lived twice as long. For the fashion world, she is both a pioneer and a cautionary tale. She was among the first supermodels, long before the term became commonplace. a face that helped transform modeling from silent elegance into raw, restless energy. Without Gia, there would be no Kate Moss, no grunge aesthetic, no worship of imperfection as a kind of beauty. She showed the world that authenticity, even if messy, could be magnetic. Yet her fall revealed the industry's cruelty, the way it consumes the young, the vulnerable, the damaged, then discards them without a backward glance. Her ghost also haunts in another way, as one of the first famous women to die of AIDS. In a time when the illness was cloaked in stigma, Gia's death exposed not only the brutality of the epidemic, but also the silence that surrounded it. She was erased partly because the fashion world was unwilling to confront what her diagnosis revealed. To remember Gia was to remember the shadows they wished to ignore. The motif of the photograph is most powerful here. Unlike mirrors, photographs endure. They freeze a moment, trapping youth and beauty in permanence. And so Gia lives on in images, leaning against a brick wall in leather and denim, reclining in silks under studio lights. Eyes that seem to look directly into the soul of whoever dares to stare back. The photographs do not age, even if she did. In them she remains immortal, the girl who burned too brightly. Philosophically, ghosts exist where memory and longing intersect. Gia's ghost persists because she embodies both the memory of a woman who changed fashion and the longing for the life she might have lived if the world had been kinder, if she had found love that lasted, if addiction had not hollowed her, if AIDS had not claimed her. Each "if" deepens the haunting, keeping her presence alive in absence. Today, her story has been retold in documentaries, biographies, even a film. Each retelling is an act of resurrection, a refusal to let her be forgotten. Yet no retelling can fully resolve the mystery of her. The contradiction between the myth and the girl, between the photographs that glow and the life that unraveled in silence. Perhaps that is why Gia endures. Because she is not simply remembered, she is unresolved. Like all ghosts, she lingers in the spaces between what we know and what we cannot explain. In the flash of a photograph, in the echo of a song from a club long closed, in the silence of a hospital room where the world forgot to bear witness. Gia Carangi's story does not conclude neatly. It hovers, unsettled. A reminder of beauty's fragility, of fame's cruelty, of the human need for love that outlives image. She is gone, and yet she is here in every photograph that refuses to fade, in every question that remains unanswered. The ghost of Gia Carangi looks back at us still, through glass, through time, through silence.